International Spy Museum. My name is Vince Houghton. I'm the historian and curator here at the museum. Is this anyone's first time here? All right, special welcome to you. Is anyone's first time coming to any of our programs here at the museum? All right, special welcome to you as well. This is our last program of 2017. Somehow it's December on Friday. Doesn't feel like it necessarily, but it is. But if you get a chance before you leave, if you haven't already, pick up our Winter 2018 communique. This has all the programming that picks up in the new year. I believe it goes through March-ish, and then we'll have ones coming after that. So the spring is chock full of great programming as well. So if you like what you hear tonight, or if you don't, come back anyway and check out another one of our programs into the new year. We're very fortunate to have an old friend here with us here tonight, Rick Schroeder, who is a former officer with the CIA's clandestine service. He held senior management positions in the agency's Director's Operations and Science and Technology, as well as the Office of Congressional Affairs and the Center for the Study of Intelligence, where he was the Deputy Director. He began his career at the CIA. It ages you if I say in 1972. In 1972. After 2 years in the United States Army as an intelligence officer for the Army staff here in Washington, but also with the U.S. Military Command in Vietnam. Since his retirement from CIA, he consults on national security and teaches at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He is also a founding advisory board member emeritus here at the International Spy Museum. He's here since the beginning, and is the author of a new book, The Foundation of the CIA, Harry Truman, the Missouri Gang, and the Origins of the Cold War. So you're not here to listen to me talk, so Rick, come on up.
And thank you all for coming out when you could be over at the Christmas market across the street. So I appreciate that. As Vince said, I've been a CIA officer for running on to 50 years now. And for the last 20 years, I've taught intelligence courses at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. And in teaching there at Georgetown, I've discovered, as well as from participating with the museum, I've discovered that there's a great interest in the CIA and in the general subject of national intelligence. But also, unfortunately, there's considerable misunderstanding, suspicion, and even outright hostility about national intelligence. So one of the reasons that I wrote this book is as a sort of a primer to try to explain, not to specialist audiences or knowledgeable people like yourselves or my colleagues, but to the general public, what it is that the intelligence community does and the kinds of functions and capabilities we have, but also the kinds of challenges we have. So what I wanted to do was, you'll forgive me from reading from notes here, but my classes at Georgetown run 2.5 hours long. So I'm used to speaking extemporaneously for 2.5 hours. And I know that none of you wants that tonight. So let me just read this. This is a simple little book about how the modern U.S. intelligence establishment was created, but also to highlight major intelligence functions by focusing on important themes, episodes, and lessons. And I'll talk about lessons, but I want to emphasize that these are not necessarily lessons that we learned or that we remembered. It's also about the men, because the Missouri Gang were all men who conceived and implemented the vision of a national intelligence service against heavy odds and in the face of widespread opposition and multiple near-death experiences. As Harry Truman said, the only thing new in the world is history that you don't know. And as Yogi Berra said, it's deja vu all over again. And that theme of repeatedly having to relearn the same lessons over and over again, runs from the early days of the OSS right down to the present. And some of the experiences of OSS officers and early CIA officers will seem very familiar to our colleagues today. Now, because I'm a historian myself, let me step back a step and remind you that every advanced state undertakes what Deputy CIA historian Mike Warner described as secret state activity to understand or influence foreign entities. Oh, there we have technology in action. And remember, as Tony Mendez, another member of the board of advisors here, has pointed out, sooner or later, technology will always let you down. So remember that. Throughout our history, the CIA has, or the U.S., not the CIA, but the U.S., has repeatedly conducted impressive intelligence during wartime, but then forgotten or abandoned the discipline in peacetime. And that's a theme that dates back all the way to the Revolution. And anybody who served in the 1990s will remember the Cold War peace dividend. You remember that? We had defeated the Soviet Union. There wasn't going to be any more history, and so we were going to have this wonderful peace dividend. And for those of us in the business, it was what was euphemistically called the intelligence glide path. And that means we went down 25% in budgets, 25% in personnel during the 1990s, just in time for 9/11. So the U.S. was founded with a great respect for intelligence, and George Washington can be considered the first director of national intelligence. But the U.S. was slow to join the great power, great game. And the great game is called that because it's based on a book by Rudyard Kipling called Kim, which he wrote in 1901 about Afghanistan. So we were a little late to this great game. In fact, the first permanent U.S. intelligence agency was the Office of Naval Intelligence in 1882, and it was created in response to the growing power and reach of the superweapons of the day, which were battleships. First time that foreign powers could credibly project power in a way that would really threaten the United States. In the 1880s, the U.S. Navy was the 12th largest in the world, even smaller than Brazil. But in 1945, you'll notice quite a number of U.S. naval officers in our story. World War I showed the U.S. what greenhorns we were in intelligence. And that's a direct quote from a distinguished Office of Naval Intelligence officer named John Allen Gaeta. And there he is right there. But officers like Gaeta and U.S. Army codebreakers in the American Black Chamber, led by Herbert Yardley, did impressive work. But after the First World War, guess what the United States did again? This hard-earned experience was allowed to go to waste after the war until again we faced the global threats of the 1930s. By then, only a few practitioners remained, along with a good number of enthusiastic amateurs. I'm going to briefly discuss a number of these characters, many of them members of the Missouri gang. But for more detail, you're going to have to read my book or ask me questions after the presentation. Here we have Truman in the middle. We have his military chief of staff to the commander-in-chief, Admiral William Leahy. We have the first DCI, Sidney Sowers. we have the second DCI, who's not from Missouri, Hoyt Vandenberg. And then on the other side, we have Roscoe Hillenkoetter, who was the first director of the CIA. We have Clark Clifford, who was a young White House lawyer, also from Missouri. And we have Larry Houston, who was general counsel of both the OSS and the CIA, also from Missouri. So a good number of these people were in fact from Missouri. But the reason that they were called the Missouri Gang was not a compliment. In Kansas City, Harry Truman, during the First World War, led a volunteer military unit, an artillery unit, that served on the Western Front. And he later gained the ambivalent support of the Pendergast machine. Boss Pendergast basically ran the Democratic machine in Kansas City. First as county executive or mayor of Kansas City, and then as senator from Missouri. In fact, Pendergast and Kansas City, this is a presentation of Kansas City. You can see with the liquor being poured out and the dance halls and stuff. He was originally called, after he joined the Senate, the senator from Pendergast, sort of as if the senator from Illinois could have been called the senator from Richard J. Daley, or something like that. In St. Louis, and here we have the much more wholesome St. Louis, the World's Fair of 1904, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the son of a German-American mail carrier, earned his U.S. Navy commission at Annapolis. Hillenkoetter had an outstanding Annapolis record, then served aboard ships and as a staff officer for senior commanders. He taught Romance languages at Annapolis, but excelled as a naval attaché or a uniformed overt intelligence officer in Paris. Finally, businessman Sidney Sowers worked his way up the Mississippi River from New Orleans through Memphis to St. Louis, making a fortune, getting to know fellow businessman, New York businessman James Forrestal, who's going to show up later in my story, and serving as a naval intelligence reservist. Of all the men involved in founding the CIA, Hillenkoetter, besides his extensive fleet experience, had the most actual intelligence experience, but left the fewest footprints or records. And I have to tell you that it was very, very difficult to find out much about this guy, even though he was the first director of the CIA and really had a quite distinguished career. Now, I'm going to say something which is sort of against my interest, but if you look at the CIA's magazine, Studies in Intelligence, the March 2016 edition, which is available free online, I wrote an article about Hillenkoetter's military and education, which essentially is the time from when he entered the Navy, served in France, and then after Pearl Harbor was Admiral Nimitz's intelligence chief in the Pacific in 1942-43. So he really had a remarkably wide-ranging experience for a fairly middle-grade naval officer. He served in France during very pivotal, turbulent years from the mid-1930s until early 1941. The Spanish Civil War, in which Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union used the war to practice war games. And just 2 years later, the Germans turned those practices on first Poland and then Western Europe. It was a time of aggressive Nazi expansionism, he was there in the first year of the European War, and he witnessed the fall of France. He was in Paris when the Germans marched in. He exercised and demonstrated all the collection, reporting, analytic, and operational skills of a classic field officer. And here we have a picture of him, courtesy of Keith Melton. That's from his 1920 U.S. Navy Academy yearbook. And then there are a couple of the ships he served on. And here is kind of an example of the world that he was in. He demonstrated collection, reporting, analytic, and operational skills as a classical field case officer. And in this case, what he did was he took a probe of Western Germany, the Rhineland, just before the Germans sealed it off, 1938. And here are the German Labor Corps boys who were building fortifications, and here the new advanced mechanized equipment that the Germans were using. And he would drive around, and because he spoke native German along with Spanish and French, he would just pick up hitchhiking GIs, German soldiers, or the Labor Corps guys, and he would offer them cigarettes and say, oh, by the way, I'm an American, and tell me what you guys are up to. And he got remarkable reports on fortifications and airfields and various kind of military facilities that they were building. This was also a period with the Anschluss of Austria and the occupation of the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia, where there were repeated war scares in Western Europe. Not actual war, but repeated panics. And the picture on the right there, or the left, the picture on the left there, is of people fleeing from Paris, not during the actual war, but because they got panicked in the late 30s. Finally, he served under the former Chief of Naval Operations and future military Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief, William Leahy. And the picture over on the fourth side is Leahy as ambassador to occupied France. Actually, he was sitting in Vichy, and that is his military staff and embassy staff when he's presenting his credentials to the Vichy government. Let's see, you folks, the second from the right is Hillenkoetter with the eyebrows, and the guy next to him, the third from the right, is Douglas MacArthur II, who was not Douglas MacArthur's son, but his nephew. He was a senior State Department officer. Then you have Leahy in the middle. He was in France on the 14th of June when the Nazis marched in to Paris, and the ambassador decided to leave Hillenkoetter and the military attaché in Paris so that they could debrief and try to elicit information from the German governor of Paris, and that's General von Stutnitz there, who happened himself to have been a military attaché, German military attaché in Warsaw. So he said to Hillenkoetter and his army buddy, hey, I understand what attachés do. You're here to gather information, so ask me anything you want. And Hillenkoetter said to him, how are you going to invade England? And he said, don't worry, we've got it all worked out. 6 weeks, the war will be over, which shows something. At any rate, Hillenkoetter transferred back to the Pacific Fleet in November 1941. just in time to have his captain killed and his battleship, West Virginia, sunk out from under him during the surprise Japanese attack on December 7th. This is West Virginia. The captain was killed. Hillenkoetter was the executive officer, so he was the senior surviving officer on the ship. Now, those of you who know the museum well, the spy museum well, may recognize that image of the flag over there. The museum has an excellent video which they show called Ground Truth. Have any of you seen that? It's really a terrific video. Unfortunately, it's not running these days because of the James Bond Villains special exhibit. But it basically talks about the importance of intelligence and how critical it is to national success or failure. And that's the final image on that video. That happens to be the flag from Hillenkotter's ship. So it's kind of fitting that the Spy Museum would show an image that dates back to the early director of the CIA. After brief sea duty, Hillenkoetter became chief of Pacific Fleet Commander Chester Nimitz's small, understaffed, disorganized, and overwhelmed intelligence center. Now, this is another one of those things that's going to happen over and over again. Hillenkoetter took over this intelligence center in the chaos immediately after Pearl Harbor. He didn't have enough staff, he didn't have the proper kinds of people, didn't have the skills he needed. Sort of, again, as Yogi Berra said, it's going to be deja vu all over again to the point when he becomes director of the CIA. His brilliant predecessor, Joseph Rochefort, was kicked aside by Washington rivals trying to shift blame for Pearl Harbor onto this gifted Japanese linguist and cryptographer. So, again, another lesson. When something goes wrong, it's never your fault. Go blame somebody else. And ideally, blame somebody who's not guilty. My editorial comment. In mid-1942, and Hillenkoetter and his Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area, that's what it was called, Intelligence Center Pacific Ocean Area, found themselves in a similar beleaguered crisis to the Central Intelligence Group that Hillenkoetter inherited in mid-1947 from DCI's directors of Central Intelligence, Sidney Sowers and Hoyt Vandenberg. So again, 5 years later, he's going to find himself in a similar pickle. Meanwhile, stepping back to mid-1941, the improvisational and devious President Franklin Roosevelt had been trying to run what passed for strategic national intelligence out of his desk drawer. There wasn't any structure at all. In July 1941, he picked ambitious, aggressive, and equally improvisational Republican New York lawyer and World War I hero William Donovan to be his coordinator of information over the bitter and unrelenting opposition of the FBI and military and naval intelligence. This is Donovan's favorite picture of himself. Shows him as a World War I hero and Congressional Medal of Honor winner. There he is as director of the OSS. And here is a 1946 aerial photograph showing, you've got the Lincoln Memorial here, you've got 23rd Street, you've got the Potomac River, and there is the original headquarters of both the OSS and the CIA on what's called Navy Hill. This is now the Kennedy Center there. So This theme of fraternal hostility runs through the whole story and is, of course, repeated during the late 40s and early 50s with the foundation of the CIA. Or for that matter, it's repeated in 2005 with the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. If you remember the log rolling that took place when the DNI was established in 2005. If intelligence is all about understanding, and I think it is, then the most important function is research and analysis, collating, evaluating, and weighing fragmentary, ambiguous, and contradictory, and often deliberately misleading information. You know, it's not just that we don't have the whole picture. It's that our adversaries are sometimes actively trying to mislead us. And if you don't believe that that happens today, look at the cover of the Washington Post tomorrow morning, or maybe today. These challenges are shared by historians, journalists, and intelligence officers. And I'm both a historian and an intelligence officer, so I can tell you these are major challenges. Two of these intelligence officers were Ivy League historians, William Langer and Sherman Kent, who essentially invented the discipline of national strategic analysis. And the CIA's Analytic College today is named for Sherman Kent. The OSS and CIA are almost unique, and this is true still today, are almost unique in putting scholars and analysis at the center of the intelligence process. Still, thrown into a global war, Donovan naturally followed the British model of espionage, which the OSS called secret intelligence, and covert action, which the British called and we called special operations. Covert action, as you know, ranges from influence operations through propaganda, sabotage, working with allies and liaison, all the way to rallying indigenous resistance and supporting military operations. And here we have a couple of examples of that. And this is the first time we see women in the picture, by the way. Donovan also encouraged the development of enabling technologies and spy gears. This is Stanley Lovell. This picture is courtesy of Keith Melton as well. The picture in the middle is a Jedburgh team just about to parachute into occupied France. And on the far side there you have Virginia Hall. And that picture, the third one over there, is the portrait of Virginia Hall, which hangs in the CIA today. And Donovan awarding her the Distinguished Service Medal. So how we got here is that thanks to World War II, the United States emerged as the only unwounded global superpower. Every other great nation was grievously crippled by the Second World War, but we came through remarkably unscathed. Thanks to Donovan, during the war, the U.S. created a unique intelligence framework. By unique, I mean they combined not only espionage and direct action, covert operations and things of that sort, but also analysis. The only other service in the world that does that is the German BND. And the reason they do was because they were created by the CIA and followed the OSS and CIA model. The war also gave us first Senator, then Vice President, and finally President Harry S. Truman, who, unlike Roosevelt, was organized, systematic, history-minded, and fact-oriented. Finally, the war left us facing the nuclear Cold War against an aggressive, expansionist Soviet Union and gave us Harry S. Truman's Missouri gang to create a new national security framework, including, among other things, the CIA. Here we have practically the first time Truman and Roosevelt ever met each other, and that was just after Truman had been named Roosevelt's vice presidential running mate in 1944. Everybody knew Roosevelt was essentially mortally ill and was not going to survive the fourth term. And so Truman was chosen as a compromise running mate for Roosevelt because, unlike Wendell Willkie, he wasn't a Northeastern liberal, and unlike South Carolina Senator Jimmy Byrne, he wasn't a segregationist. So he was a solid Midwestern New Dealer. And by the way, he's only 2 years younger than Roosevelt. He's 60 in that picture, and Roosevelt is 62. The next picture, April 12th, 1945, he's being sworn in. As with Hillenkoetter in the U.S. Navy after Pearl Harbor, Truman in April 1945 had no time to find his footing before being pushed onto the global stage to face Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin at Potsdam. He's also facing the decision to deploy the atomic bomb against Japan. This is July 1945, and as you know, the next month, he decided to drop the atomic bombs. Since Casablanca, the Casablanca summit in 1943, Europe was seen as the central focus for the global war, and the division of post-war Europe had already been decided at Yalta just before Roosevelt died. So there wasn't any question anymore that the Russians were going to get all of Eastern Europe. OSS Burn Chief Allen Dulles, there in the middle, was appointed to run OSS Germany, and many OSS officers were shifted to the Far East where the war was still going on. In the picture on the right, you see Dulles, and on his right is another future director of the CIA, Richard Helms. At the end of the war in September 1945, the U.S. stood as the only nuclear-armed global superpower, and the OSS was almost a global service with broad strategic and tactical intelligence functions and capabilities. So here you have all the OSS offices in Western Europe and North Africa, and there you have them all in Southeast Asia. This is in the end of 1944, early 1945. You notice there's no presence in Latin America. And that's another reason, because of all the rivalries, the FBI exercised exclusive control over activities in Latin America, and the OSS never got in there. Unfortunately, the OSS was also a temporary wartime agency, which by law had to be immediately disbanded at the end of the war, as it was within 3 weeks of the formal Japanese surrender at Tokyo Bay. So 3 weeks after the Japanese surrendered, the OSS was abolished. And basically, this whole infrastructure and most of the 13,000 to 14,000 members of the OSS were suddenly out of jobs. Almost immediately thereafter, almost the entire active duty Army and Navy were also abolished. We went from 16 million men in the Army and Navy down to less than 1 million. Without a doubt, that was the world's greatest peace dividend, vastly more than what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall. However, the war, along with the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and also actually the demobilization of the American military, transformed the Western world, because all those soldiers came home, they all get the GI Bill, they all got married, they all started having babies, they all bought houses under GI loans, they all went to college, and the boom that the United States enjoyed in the 50s and 60s is in large measure because of the demobilization there. Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine also managed to stabilize and rebuild Western Europe. As the Soviet Union consolidated its hold on Eastern Europe, Truman, who considered Donovan a self-promoter, ignored his calls for a peacetime strategic intelligence service and simply wiped out the OSS. Now, there's a considerable controversy about that, whether it was just sort of wrong-headedness on Truman's part. The point was that as a temporary organization, the OSS could not continue. It had to be dissolved, and so it was. But Truman was painfully aware of the ways fragmentation, disorganization, and inter-service rivalries had contributed to Pearl Harbor, and he wanted to create a new post-war military and national intelligence structure. So he did very consciously want to get something in place to kind of prepare the United States for the post-war world. To do so, he turned to his military chief of staff and former ambassador to Vichy, France, Fleet Admiral William Leahy, and his White House lawyer, Missourian Clark Clifford, as well as to a business friend of his Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, and that's Deputy Chief of Naval Intelligence, Rear Admiral Sidney Sowers. Truman may have been an unlikely and underestimated president, but Sowers was an even more improbable intelligence manager. Unlike Hillenkoetter or even Allen Dulles, he had almost no practical intelligence experience. He basically had run grocery stores, banks, and insurance companies before the war. He frankly admitted that he got his position as deputy chief of the Office of Naval Intelligence thanks to his friendship with Forrestal, because he was bored and lonesome as local naval intelligence chief in Charleston, South Carolina, and San Juan, Puerto Rico. There's Sowers on the far end there. His primary claim to fame in Charleston was debriefing the first German U-boat crew captured off the United States. There's Sowers, there's a British Navy officer, there are 2 German U-boat POWs, and another naval intelligence officer. And that's basically what Sowers did. He was a Navy commander. He got promoted to Rear Admiral and wound up as Deputy Chief of Naval Intelligence, and was brought in to help create the new national intelligence structure because he understood the military position on how the new post-war organization should be created. Now, the next 2 years were like the world's most convoluted Wagnerian opera, with scheming, intriguing, backstabbing, and histrionics. Most of them focused on the creation of the new national defense establishment rather than the new national intelligence establishment, which was the CIA. So everybody was occupied with fighting about whether they were going to have more aircraft carriers or more strategic bombers. The Air Force and the Navy were fighting it out, and in the meantime, Clark Clifford and Leahy were just trying to slip the new CIA under the radar, and actually succeeded in doing that. Early agency and other military intelligence historians have concentrated on all of this inside the Beltway maneuvering, so I'm not going to do that. And I didn't do very much of it in the book either. Hillenkoetter, well out of the Washington sniping, had spent the war in the Pacific in charge of Nimitz's destroyers. Here's his flagship and all the little baby destroyers next to it. After the war, he commanded the world's most famous battleship, USS Missouri, immediately after the war on a celebrated cruise to Greece and Turkey. And this is when the communists were threatening both Greece, Turkey, and Yugoslavia, were actually threatening Italy. So by sending Hillenkoetter and this battleship to the Mediterranean, Truman was emphasizing that the United States had the military power, sort of indirectly reminding people, hey, we also had the atomic bomb. He then returned to Paris as a military attaché. And there he is on the far right as military attaché. However, as you can see from the picture in the middle, during his Missouri command, there he is with a bunch of sailors from the ship who happened to have been born in Missouri. He was visiting St. Louis, sort of on a VIP welcome back. And one of those sailors was black. So he proved himself in an episode that I recount in the book, a civil rights trailblazer in January of 1946, 2 years before Truman integrated the U.S. military. So he brought the black sailor with him and insisted that he participate along with all the white sailors in all the festivities that took place. He was also, amazingly, a defender of a persecuted homosexual Office of Policy Coordination manager by the name of Carmel Offee that Joe McCarthy tried to smear. So here he is, pioneer in civil rights, pioneer even in defending homosexuals. In France, he was awarded the French Legion of Honor and was promoted to Rear Admiral before being recalled to take over Truman's Central Intelligence Group. Now, Sowers and Vandenberg had both been directors of Central Intelligence, but there wasn't a CIA at that point. There was only a very, very small Central Intelligence Group. So Hillenkoetter was the first DCI who actually commanded the CIA. It was created in September of 1947 under the National Security Act. Interestingly enough, none of the early DCIs, from Sowers to Air Corps Lieutenant General Hoyt Vandenberg to Rear Admiral Hillenkoetter to Army Lieutenant General Walter Beadle Smith, who was the next director, wanted the job of trying to recreate or create a national intelligence service in the face of highly skilled, organized, and aggressive Soviet adversary, and in an atmosphere of endless domestic and international crises. Some of them I detail in the book, a kind of a Hillenkoetter's 6 crises. So here we have the inventors of the high five, I understand, from Twitter today. Here we have Harry Truman watching the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court swearing in Helen Connor, Sidney Sowers, and a man by the name of Joseph Hill, who was the head of the National Defense Resources Board. This is in September of 1947. And there you have the National Security Council with, let me point out a few people for you here. Whoops, I'm standing in the way. Here you have Truman, here you have Secretary of State, General George Marshall. Here you have Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. Remember, he's Sowers' friend. Here you have the DCI, Hillenkoetter, and there you have Sidney Sowers, who stayed with Truman after his brief tour as director of the Central Intelligence Group. He helped create the CIA and the national security structure, and he stayed on as executive secretary of the National Security Council, basically through the entire Truman administration. So there you have the whole bunch of them. However, in the face of hostility from his Washington enemies, most of whom outranked him, and one of whom, Allen Dulles, coveted his job, Hillenkoetter lasted for 3 eventful years before returning to the fleet to fight another war. And in part, the final blow to his position was the Korean War. This time, he went back to Korea as commander of a cruiser squadron off Korea, and that's his flagship, USS St. Paul. You'll notice that the photo of the turnover to Beadle Smith in late 1950, there you have Hillenkoetter and Beadle Smith, is one of the few pictures of Hillenkoetter smiling. He's happy to be out of there and back on the deck of a battleship. Here we have Beadle Smith, characteristically glum. Here we have Frank Wisner, who also plays a role in my book. He was the director of covert action, which at that time was divided from espionage, is the Office of Policy Coordination. Carmel Offee, the homosexual whom Joe McCarthy went after, was actually working for Wisner, not Hillenkoetter, but it was Hillenkoetter who went to bat for him. Here you have Walter Folsheimer, who's a distinguished senior officer. He was the head of congressional affairs. Here we have Larry Houston, another Missourian who was the general counsel of the OSS and then the CIA. Hillenkoetter returned to obscurity and was never heard of again until February of 1960, when he wrote an astonishing letter to the New York Times. Now, what could he possibly have been writing about? He was then, for some reason that I've never been able to figure out, a member of a private fringe group called the National Investigative Committee on Aerial Phenomena. It's called NICAP. And he complained in that letter in 1960 about U.S. government efforts to conceal the existence of UFOs. Where that came from, I have no idea. This led to an internal CIA debate about whether to tell him about the U-2. Houston and the senior members like Dulles, Allen Dulles, said, gee, maybe we ought to tell him that there is, in fact, this secret airplane. They decided not to do it, but it became spectacularly public 2 months later on the 1st of May, 1960, when Gary Powers was shot down over Russia. So Hillenkoetter was only half wrong. He's forgotten as the first director of the CIA. However, Hillenkoetter is now a cult figure in the UFO community. Who knew? If you Google Hillenkoetter, the first thing that pops up is all this conspiracy stuff about UFOs. And Hillenkoetter, along with Curtis LeMay, everybody remembers who Curtis LeMay was, right? Strategic Air Command, bomb them back to the Stone Age. Both Hillenkoetter and LeMay were supposedly honored with a Gerald Ford aircraft carrier-sized spaceship, allegedly launched by the U.S. government in 1988 at the end of the Reagan administration. Here's the Jerry Ford. Over there is a picture of the Jerry Ford, and that's the size of the USS Hillenkoetter, part of the Solar Warden space fleet that the United States launched in the late 1980s, supposedly. I can neither confirm nor deny. The last word about the CIA, however, should be left to its creator, Harry Truman. Almost as soon as the OSS was abolished, he began pestering his first director of Central Intelligence, Sidney Sowers, with the demand, "Where's my newspaper?" Almost 20 years later, even after a very public denunciation of how the CIA had strayed under DCI Allen Dulles, Truman also wrote below his official portrait at CIA headquarters that the CIA is a necessity to the President of the United States, from one who knows. That's the first presidential portrait in the CIA headquarters, and that's the inscription. So that's basically the story I wanted to tell you folks tonight. And I left a lot out because I clearly would enjoy it if you read the book. I think you'll find it interesting. A lot of the pictures are from the book. I would just leave you with a couple of thoughts. One is Harry Truman's, "The only thing new in the world is history you don't know." And that's actually not a made-up quote. It's from Merle Miller's Plain Speaking. So it's a direct quote from Truman. Then again, deja vu all over again. That's Yogi Berra, of course. "Never let the national interest stand in the way of protecting your rice bowl." That's sort of the way Washington works, right? You know? And sometimes your worst enemies are your brothers. That's Anthony Scaramucci, the mooch, this very year. So, you know, the intrigues that went on here in the United States, the painful lessons that the OSS learned overseas that we have to keep learning over and over again. If you have any questions about that, be delighted to answer them. I can read you some more of these laws here that I came up with, but I think that's enough for now. So thank you all very much. So any questions? Sir.
Good. Okay, hold on, we've got a mic.
Oh, you got a microphone.
You spoke of Admiral Hillenkoetter in the most glowing terms that I've ever heard, in a positive light, which is kind of odd considering that all the literature that even the CIA puts out today, they don't talk very positively about him. And you mentioned that there's a lack of documentation on his early involvement. It seems to me there's a lack of documentation, period, from the time that the OSS was disbanded up until the CIA was founded. And do you have any reason why there's so little documentation?
Well, let's see. In terms of why there's not more documentation, First of all, in the early years, both of the OSS and the CIA, the people involved and Congress and the government in general felt that the stuff ought to be secret. In fact, there's another excellent book by a man by the name of David Barrett called The CIA and Congress that really goes into great depth about the creation. Hillenkoetter himself wasn't involved in the creation. He was off happily being a naval attaché during that period. And you may find this hard to believe, but government records are not always well organized, and they're not perfect. And I spent many, many frustrating days in the National Archives going back over U.S. Navy attaché reports to try to get something about Hillenkotter's experiences in Europe. The frustrating thing about Hillenkoetter is if you look at books, histories, the way Washingtonians do, by turning immediately to the index and looking for your name. Well, I did that with Hillenkoetter. I would look at histories and turn to the index and try to find Hillenkoetter and be lucky to find a phrase, let alone a sentence. So there really wasn't very much. He kept an official diary when he was director of the CIA, but there's very little in that. He never wrote anything himself, except in the 1930s and 40s when he was a military attaché. And the National Archives has the original paper with his original ink signature on it. But that's it. He only had one child who died apparently unmarried, and he just sort of disappeared. Leahy, on the other hand, kept a diary every day of his life. And immediately after the war, Leahy's diaries were published. Truman, of course, had a lot of stuff written about him. Everybody writes about Donovan. Nobody writes much about Sidney Sowers. Sowers, however, sat for a couple of interviews, CIA interviews, which were originally classified. Sowers was a very interesting guy because he had a very sharp tongue. And so some of his more unvarnished opinions are really very interesting. But it's a very small body of work even on him. And if you go to the Truman Library, and Sowers remained a good friend of Truman's to the end of his life, if you want to see the Sowers Papers, they're one linear foot of paper. So the only one who really wrote very much was Leahy. And Clifford, of course. But Clifford waited until the 1980s to write his memoirs. So you're sort of left sort of scrambling. These people are very opaque, and it's very frustrating to see how little you really can find out about him. And that's why I think he's underappreciated. At the time, when he was confirmed as director of the CIA in the fall of 1947, it was a unanimous vote in the Senate to reconfirm him. So they actually held him in very high regard. As I said, he was there in a very, very difficult period, and a lot of crap happened while he was DCI. And he got blamed for a lot of it. You know, the Soviets detonated an atomic bomb, and it took us about a month to figure out they'd done it. China fell to Mao Zedong. And of course, the Korean War started. But at that point, the CIA was not the well-oiled machine and the vast global organization that we have today. It was just a very small group of people who were scrambling to try to put together. It's kind of like the expression, you know, when you're up to your butt in alligators, it's hard to remember that your mission was to save the world for democracy. And also, a lot of the things that the OSS had tried and failed at during the Second World War, people like Frank Wisner tried again in the early 1950s, and they failed again. So 2 weeks ago, John Prados was here, is talking about his book, The Ghosts of Langley, and it was an unending litany of failures and screw-ups or malice or incompetence. And what I'd like to remind you is that these folks were all honorable, patriotic people who were trying the best they could under very difficult circumstances. But not everybody had the same vision of what the best was. And J. Edgar Hoover's vision was very different from, say, Helen Cotter's vision. Ma'am.
Rick, I wanted to actually ask you a question that related back to John's talk, John Prados's talk, and it was just very much about the notes, and it plays into his question about the notes and the documentation that you've been talking about. John referenced Truman notes that were like, someone wore a big hat, and what did that mean? He really said the notes were very just kind of conversational, the early notes, unless I misunderstood. He was talking about documentation from the Truman years and that this early foundation period that were, you know, maybe I'm making this up, but I thought very lackadaisical, not conveying any substance.
Well, you know, it's kind of interesting because Truman and Sowers both are very human people. And Truman is notorious for having written a nasty letter to a music critic who was mean to his daughter. You know, said nasty things about her and how Margaret, and how he was going to punch him in the face and kick him in the whatevers. So Truman would form very strong opinions very quickly, and he had enemies, one of whom was Allen Dulles. And the reason he didn't like Dulles was because Dulles was a senior political advisor to John Dewey, the governor of New York, who was running against Truman in 1948. And Dulles thought that when Dewey beat Truman, and it was clear that that was going to happen, I mean, even the Chicago Tribune knew that Dewey was going to beat Truman. Dulles was going to become the director of the CIA. Well, it didn't happen. Truman not only had strong opinions, but he was subject to forgetfulness. And in 1964, for example, he wrote a letter to the Washington Post, and he said, oh, the CIA has gone terribly wrong. They've strayed off into overthrowing governments and all this covert action stuff. Well, that had all happened under Dulles, and he didn't like Dulles. Truman forgot that in 1947, when he created the CIA, he did so specifically so that it could do things like covert actions on behalf of Democratic parties in the Italian election of 1947. So, you know, Truman was not an opponent of a lot of these things going on. He just sort of changed his public position on it. Sowers also had very strong opinions. He didn't like Dulles either. And in fact, when it came to Hoyt Vandenberg, who was only director for about a year, Vandenberg didn't want the job, and Sowers, who was trying to leave the job, said to Vandenberg, well, look, I know you don't want to be director of Central Intelligence. You want to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force when they create an Air Force. But they're not going to make you Chief of Staff of the Air Force just because you're handsome. You have to go and do something first. So, you know, these are the kind of stories that you get from, bless his heart, old Harry, but also from Sowers. But a lot of that stuff was originally, the Sowers material was originally classified. And those early histories of all the maneuvering was classified as well. And they were published internally in the CIA, and they were only declassified literally decades later. So, okay. Sir, question?
Hi there. How quickly did the CIA establish relationships with other intelligence agencies around the world? Because I know that MI6 was a model for CIA originally, as it was set up, and there was close links between OSS and the UK during the Second World War. But how quickly were those relationships between CIA and other international intelligence agencies established? Did that take a long time, or was that quite quick?
Well, Christopher Andrew, who's one of the great military intelligence historians, has said that the American intelligence establishment, the OSS, was the greatest covert action that the British ever accomplished. Because remember I said that Roosevelt ran foreign policy out of his hip pocket. One of the things he did before we entered the Second World War was he dispatched personal friends around the world to sort of report to him on what was going on, rather than relying upon the State Department, who's actually supposed to do international affairs and reporting. He would dispatch people, and one of the people he dispatched was Donovan. And the British intelligence chief in Washington sent a note to London and said, hey, Donovan is coming to London, give him the VIP treatment. He met the king, Churchill greeted him. They had all of this red carpet rolled out. And one of the results of that was Donovan came back and immediately started working with Roosevelt to try to get Lend-Lease, the 50 destroyers that England needed to protect their convoys and things of that sort. So the British actually sort of won over Donovan, and the OSS was kind of created on the British model, and it used British techniques, and the British trained the first wave of OSS officers. So that was the closest relationship, really, from the very beginning. Now, in the Far East, for example, in places like Thailand, which were occupied by the Japanese, the Thai government had been left in place by the Japanese, and they were basically running a sort of an undercover government and were helping the OSS in Thailand. In fact, the Thai police would drive OSS officers around the country in Thai police cars. So they were protecting them. It was much more ambiguous in places like France, where you had the royalists fighting against the communists, fighting against the Democrats, and there wasn't really a stable government there. China was the same way, with the nationalists and the warlords and the communists. Yugoslavia, the same. You had royalists versus communists. The other intelligence service that really we worked with very, very closely from the beginning was the one we invented, and that's the West German Federal Intelligence Service, which started off as the Gehlen organization, which had been the Nazi intelligence organization for the Eastern Army, in other words, the army fighting against the Soviet Union. And after the war, Gehlen volunteered his organization to the U.S. Army. And when the CIA was created in 1947, the CIA basically took over the Gehlen organization, and it became the Federal Intelligence Service, and the relationship with them is still very close. So, you know, from the very beginning, working with indigenous peoples or local either resistance or governments has always been a part of the way the OSS worked. And incidentally, I'm detecting that you're from the Empire there. That was a cause of great conflict between us and the Brits, and particularly in Southeast Asia. The military command there was called the South Asian, SEAC, Southeast Asian Command. It was commanded by Lord Louis Mountbatten. And the OSS called the Southeast Asia Command Saving Europe's Asiatic Colonies, which is why the OSS worked much more closely with Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh than they did either with the British or the French, because not only did the OSS recognize, but all of those captive peoples recognized that all the Brits and the French wanted to do was to come back in and take over their empires once the Japanese were pushed out. So, sir.
Wait, sir.
Just a quick question, if you could elaborate also on perhaps Singapore and Hong Kong regarding what you were discussing when it comes to Western powers trying to recolonize these territories after the Japanese vacated. Just curious to see where, let's say, Singapore and Hong Kong and all these, let's say, key posts play a role in the greater scheme of things.
Well, actually, I mention them both in the book, but not in a good way, because the Japanese, after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Douglas MacArthur basically had a day warning to prepare before the Japanese moved against the Philippines and Hong Kong and Singapore. And unaccountably, he didn't do anything. He left his bombers on the ground where the Japanese destroyed them, and the Japanese just sort of swept right through there. And MacArthur would never let the OSS into his operational area. That's why they could only operate in Thailand, Indochina, Burma, and then China. So the area of Singapore and Hong Kong was sort of off limits to the OSS. And, you know, they were relatively small colonial outposts. And it didn't really play a big geopolitical role. I'm not a fan of either Dulles or MacArthur, by the way. Sorry. Anything else? Ma'am.
So my memory is kind of vague, but if I remember correctly, after Japan was occupied, I think there was an organization by the name of CIC that was responsible for intelligence in Japan, and later on it was absorbed to CIA. So is this mostly military personnel who were responsible for intelligence in Japan after the war?
After the OSS was abolished, September of 1945, there was still a very large military intelligence and naval intelligence. These had dated back to the 1880s. The OSS pretty much focused on strategic intelligence with their analysts, people like Sherman Kent, William Langer, and they concentrated on preparing the battle space before the invasion of Normandy, things like that. But the Army Counterintelligence Corps was the one that was part of the big army, big green machine. And when the OSS left in 1945, everybody went home, the Army Counterintelligence Corps in Japan and the Army Counterintelligence Corps in Germany were basically what was left. And what they were doing in Germany was basically denazification. They were going around trying to capture all of the ex-Nazis, especially the war criminals. The same thing happened to a certain extent in Japan, although MacArthur was not as aggressive in sort of the de-fascizing of Japan as they were in Germany. It was the Counterintelligence Corps that got Galen's organization, the ex-Nazi intelligence organization in 1945. And they ran it until 1947, basically, until the CIA took over. And there was considerable question about whether or not the CIA was going to take the German intel group, because they were all, they'd all been Nazi army officers. That 2-year period was one where there were a lot of people scrambling around, basically military intelligence people, trying to do what they could, both in the Far East and in Europe. But the military was also shrinking. They went from 16 million to 500,000 in basically a year. So they were outnumbered, outgunned, outmanned. That's when a lot of things happened in Western Europe, how a lot of the ex-Nazis wound up in Latin America. There were various efforts to try to get Jewish refugees out of the concentration camps, and a lot of Eastern European displaced people who didn't want to go back to places like Hungary or Czechoslovakia or East Germany once the communists took over. And a lot of those people managed to get into these refugee channels who were Nazis, because everybody just got overwhelmed. There just weren't enough people, enough records to track everybody down. So if John Prados wants to talk about how the CIA helped Nazis escape and wind up in Latin America, in some cases it happened, but it was obviously not intentional. And if you got 1,000 refugees together, it's just like what happened in Europe in the last 2 years, with hundreds of thousands of Syrians and Libyans and everybody else trying to escape, trying to get into Europe, and the problems that the security forces and the police forces have in differentiating who is a legitimate refugee and who's an ISIS sleeper, for example. So that was sort of what was going on. It's not an easy time. Okay.
Well, we thank you, Rick.
Thank you all very
so
much.
much.
I appreciate it.